Welcome to the Epic Score Podcast. I'm your host, Gabe Shadid. I'm going to start today. Somebody asked to see a picture of the race car. So I'm sorry I didn't show you one before. Here's the car. It's a 2009 BMW M3 four-door. It's been fully gutted. A race cage has been welded in. It has full aero with a 71-inch wing, a three-way MCS suspension, carbon doors. It's been supercharged, puts down 560 horsepower at the wheels. It has AP Racing brakes. It runs racing slick tires, has a titanium exhaust. Of this platform car, it's been the fastest one in the country for the last 10 years. I've competed in time attack at many tracks around the United States, including the Formula One track in Austin, Texas, Circuit of the Americas. And here's a little in-car video of me driving on the Formula One track in Texas. I was actually able to get third place and stand on a Formula One podium, that second story podium. That was pretty cool. All right, so that's the race car. If you want to hear more about the race car, we can talk about that more in the future. For now, I want to get back to the origin stories of Epic Score and how I was able to work my way up. This story has a lot of detail to it. I don't want to bore anybody to death, but this is the story. I've been asked so many times, and I'm just trying to get into those details so that you can see there are hard decisions. There are quick decisions you have to make on the fly, things you didn't predict. We're going to see some of that today in part 2 of the story. And I just want to put out the idea that to be a composer, oftentimes you sort of have to start with something else first that's related or nearby or something like that, because composing music really is about trust. Do they trust you to do it? Lots of people say they can write music, and a fair amount of people can write music, but are they trusted to do it when it counts, when it matters on a deadline? And quite often, it takes time to build that trust. And that's what this story is about, I think you're going to see as we get into it today. So in our last studio chat, the stopping point was I got a music editing job. But I still had to answer telephones for the first 4 hours of my shift. And then I got into the studio for my last 4 hours. And I don't regret answering telephones because it really taught me how a studio runs. All those calls that come in, you learn who's important and gets through. You learn who's not important and gets to voicemail. I found those things very valuable, and I certainly did not regret learning any of that stuff. So now I'm in the studio editing music, and I am learning so much about how music works in the media world. And that was extremely valuable. And I started getting exposure to producers, music supervisors. These are the kinds of people that composers wish they knew. They're the decision makers. And now I was in the middle of that world. So as a new person in the audio department, I was attending the regular audio department meetings. And the very first meeting I ever attended, something occurred that had a huge impact on my future life in music. And of course, at the time, I had no idea that this would be the case. So we're in this meeting, and the studio owner looks at everybody and says, "Hey, everybody, I need a point person from our studio to be the representative to all the music libraries that we have." And I didn't know what was going on, but everybody started shrinking into their chairs. Nobody wanted the task. And I didn't know any better. This is no genius move. This is no fantastic strategy. This is just a new guy trying to make a good impression. And I raised my hand. I said, "I'll do it." And everybody looked at me like, "Oh, look, the idiot will do it." Yay, we don't have to do it. That simple decision was probably the single most important thing I ever did for my future music career. And I had no idea. That was 1995. Epic Score didn't exist until 2006. It was a long time from that decision to what Epic Score finally became. Basically, this studio had America's Most Wanted. And the music libraries really wanted to get their music on that show. But nobody knew how music actually got chosen, selected, approved, put in the show. They didn't know who was doing it, how it was happening, whether it was happening at the audio studio, whether it was the video editors. Nobody knew. So I took the job seriously, and I called every single music library that we had a relationship with and said, "Hi, I'm Gabe from such and such, and this is what's going on." And instantly, I became best friends with either the owners or the top salespeople of every major music library in the United States. So this task of being the point person to the music libraries, it was making me look good as an employee because I took on a task that nobody wanted. And at the same time, I looked good to the music libraries because I was helping them make more money. And the side effect was I had met all these big players in the music library industry. In fact, this is how I initially met APM Music, who became Epic Score's distributor many years later. We were using a ton of APM's music, so we were making them a lot of money. They were very happy, and this set up a very nice relationship. Also, I was starting to learn about the business side of music, and that was really great. So as a new person in the audio department, the studio was taking on free pro bono work to help train me. People call into studios all the time asking if they can get free mix time, stuff like that. They get those kinds of calls. I know because I was taking the phone calls. Studios usually probably say no to most of that, but they do say yes when they're trying to train somebody. And they tell the client, hey, this person's new. We're giving you the time for free. Bring your job in. They're going to work on it. If it takes longer than normal, sorry, you didn't pay anything for it. So they did that with me. And for my first ever client session, the client walks in. It's a free session to them. This client was actually a full paying client normally, but she needed a favor. So the studio put her in a room with me and she was kind of cautious. She knew I was a phone answering person and she kind of came in grumbling. Why is the phone guy doing a session? But I just took it and we start the session and it was a 30-second commercial. She had the video edited somewhere and now she needed the audio done. And I loaded it in and something just was wrong with this commercial and it was very stressful and she was annoyed and I'm annoyed and nobody knew what was going on. But basically I'm loading in 30-second music and the music's ending short. It turned out the video editor had messed up and made it a 34-second commercial. I'm the one who finally figured out, like, hey, this thing's 34 seconds. And now she's freaking out because now her commercial's the wrong length and I'm trying to figure it out. And I finally figured, hey, look, we can cut this thing off. I can edit black video in right at 30 seconds. I can cut it short and it's going to be fine. So then I was the hero of the session because the session went great. You know, I was a decent mixer already and I was ready to go. And she went to the owners and she was saying such nice things about me. And that was the beginning of starting to build reputation with clients. And that's what it's about. It's that trust. But you know, it wasn't just an easy road. Life is full of weird things sometimes. One of the senior audio mixers would scream at me at night. You will never amount to anything. You are not going to make it. You will not succeed in this industry. Literally screaming in my face. I'm happy to report to you, I took his room over 2 years later. But you get subjected to weird things that you just have to weather. Anyway, America's Most Wanted was the big client of the studio. And that show was a little unique in that they used both composer scores and library music on a regular basis. So you learned how composers did their thing and you learned how library music had to work in a show like that. And they were producing 45 one-hour shows every year. So there was tons of TV being produced. And everybody wanted to get on that show so they could get national television royalties. So I was progressing as a music editor. And people were taking notice and they knew I was pretty fast, pretty good. But I wasn't on America's Most Wanted yet. I was still on the spinoff Manhunter. But one night, I got a shot. And I got that shot because a composer had done a custom score for a fairly long segment that was a reenactment. Actors, action, the whole bit. It wasn't just a news segment. And the score had come in early in the week, and everybody in the studio was afraid that it wasn't going to go final. Everybody was afraid it wasn't good enough. But it kept going, and it kept going, and it kept going, and it stayed in. And the line producer, they didn't make any comments about the music. And Friday night is the deadline because the show airs on Saturday. And Friday night at 6:00, America's Most Wanted killed the music on that piece. And Everybody in the studio freaked out. They were super angry because they knew all week that the music was not good enough for the segment. It was a really high profile segment. And one of the senior sound guys knew I was a decent music editor, and he recommended me to the guy working on the project. And he said, Gabe's pretty quick. You might just want to give him a shot. Because basically it was 6:00, and normally that would probably have taken most people 6 to 7 hours to put in new music. It was a long segment, ton of action, custom action, battles, gunfights, you name it. So out of pure desperation, and you're going to see that's a story of my life. Out of pure desperation, they gave me the studio and they said, do it as fast as you can, man. And so I grabbed all my favorite music, all the biggest action stuff I knew of because I'd been editing so much stuff, and I piled it in. And in 2 hours, I had edited this thing across like a 10 or 12 minute segment, big action, all these custom edit points, all this stuff. And it sailed through without any notes. It got approved. And everybody was very kind to me in the studio. They told the owners what I had done and that I had saved everybody from a really, really long night. So that was my shot. I was able to deliver. And, that's how you have to make it happen in this world. Things continued to go well for me in the night shift. I was doing sessions. I was doing music editing. But in the summer of 1996, America's Most Wanted got canceled. It didn't stay canceled. It was only off for a couple of months because a bunch of people, governors and lawmakers and the police, law enforcement, they all fought really hard to get it brought back. And it worked. But for a couple of months, it was canceled. And the studio decided they had to cut back. And I got laid off. I was the expendable one. That turned into a crazy story because after I got laid off, I went to the break room and told everybody, hey, I got laid off. And someone in the break room said, hey, there's a job opening at a studio in Washington, D.C. But somebody else in the break room also heard that. And that person was unhappy at the studio we were at. So I went and applied for that job, and it was looking good. But they went and applied for the same job, and they were more senior than me. And guess what? They got the job. Like, gosh. But that now left an open seat at my original studio. And they kind of asked around quietly, hey, do you think Gabe would come back if we offered him the job? And everybody was like, I don't know. You're just going to have to ask him. And this is when sometimes you have to swallow your pride. So I went back in, talked to the owner, and they offered me now a day shift with my own studio with more money. Oh, and by the way, I was out for 3 weeks. From when they laid me off to when I came back was exactly 3 weeks. And they had given me 3 weeks of severance when they laid me off. So I had like a 3-week stressful vacation, but I had a 3-week vacation. You never know how these things are going to work. And it was fantastic for my future career that I went back. All right, I'm day shift. They gave me a studio I can call my own. I'm getting to know the producers of America's Most Wanted. Everybody knew I did music on the side, mainly for fun. Everybody's friendly, getting to know each other. One of the producers is like, hey, play me what you've been doing. I played him my music. He's like, hey, that's really great. Stick it in the show. And that was the beginning of my music career. Things really started to pick up from that point on. I was making music beds that could be used in like the news segments. I was doing custom scores for the reenactment segments. So I'd be at the studio all day, and then I'd run home with a videotape and I'd score all night till 4 or 5 in the morning, run back to the studio, put the music in, get it approved. It was actually going really well. But then in 1997, something occurred that made me realize I can only go so far at this studio. Remember that first client I did the free job with? She walked in a couple years later and she said, I want to work with Gabriel to compose the logo for my production company. The problem was the studio had an in-house staff composer and they wanted him to do the job, but she didn't want to work with him. I had nothing to do with the situation. I had never asked her for any work or anything like that. I was pretty careful. America's Most Wanted was fine. Nobody worried about that. But going and doing a custom job for an existing client outside of America's Most Wanted, well, it turned out to be prickly. And I never pursued it, but She was pursuing it. She said, hey, if you're going to make me work with the in-house composer, I'm going elsewhere. They didn't want her to leave. So I got called into a meeting with a couple of the owners. They were very unhappy. They said, hey, this client will only work with you. You know, we have an in-house composer. We don't want her to go anywhere else. So they said, you can do the job, but you have to do it on your own time, not studio hours, and you have to do it for free. You know what? You could have told me I had to come walking in naked singing opera. And at that point in my life, I would have done it. Nothing was getting in my way. So I did the job and it went great. She loved it. But it was at that point that I realized for me to go on the journey I wanted with music, I was going to have to make a move at some point. Sometimes situations exist that get in the way of your goals, and you just have to figure out your next move. This is a good time to pause the professional part of the story and talk about where my personal life was at this point, because these kinds of things can affect these situations quite a bit. I started dating my wife right after I got the music editing job in 1995. But my wife made it clear right from the beginning she did not want to end up on the East Coast forever. She wanted to go back out west where she was from. I truly believe without her influence, I would not have had the ambition to leave the East Coast. So this was interesting to me because I felt like my industry was based in Los Angeles and she was willing to move there, but I certainly had no clue about anything in Los Angeles. So we quietly started to dream about the idea of moving to LA. But we certainly couldn't afford to get married and move to LA in the same year. So we had to figure out, do we get married first and go to LA later? Do we go to LA first and then get married later? We decided to get married first, save up some money, and then see if we could move to LA later. So we got engaged in 96, we got married in 97, and then we started dreaming, see if we could move to LA in 1998. During this time, America's Most Wanted continued to have an endless need for music. You could only use the same piece of music 2, maybe 3 times max. And then the producers were like, we never want to hear that piece of music ever again. And it was tough. There was 3 of us choosing music for that show. You never knew what the other person was choosing. You go through all that work, you put the music in, and it gets rejected because they've heard the music too many times. Super frustrating. So I kept saying to myself, we just need more music for this show. So I did 2 things to try to get more music for the show. I went to Fox and I said, I have an idea. Can your legal department help me? They said, yeah. I created a deal where we knew a bunch of composers because composers were making scores for the show. And there were some composers we really liked. So I contacted these composers and I said, look, we don't have much budget, but I want you to be a music library to our show. So you make the music, you don't get paid to make it, but when we use it, you'll get paid a licensing fee. You'll get the composer royalty, and it's your music. You can get the publishing as well. Nobody was giving a composer that deal ever. But I was so desperate to get more music. This is the deal I was putting out. And a couple composers took the deal. And it was a great deal. One composer made over 1,000 tracks. He made a whole career off of it, and good for him. And it was non-exclusive. You could take that music and go license it elsewhere too. It was a great deal. Best deal ever. The second thing I started doing was I started calling all these music libraries that we had relationships with. And I was kind of poking it a little bit. I was saying, hey, we don't have enough drama music, and I've been writing music to help fill the gaps. Part of me was hoping that one of them might maybe say, hey, do you want to write for us? And it worked. One of them actually did. It was Sonaton. It's a German music library. They said, hey, send us a demo. Let us see what you've been doing. So I did. At the beginning of 1997, I sent them a demo and it went quiet. Nothing happened. I was like, oh, darn. Right at the beginning of December 1997, my phone rang and it was Sonaton. And the person said, in a bit of a panic, how quickly can you write 15 tracks of music? Can you do it in a month? And I was like, oh no. I had never done a commercial music library job before. I'd been doing some music beds. I'd done a little bit of score stuff, but 15 tracks. I said yes. I was all on board, but I didn't know if I could do it. And at the time, I wondered, what was the panic? Why did they seem so concerned in such a short turnaround as well? I mean, this is music library world. What was the super tight deadline? Regardless, they just said, hey, please just start the job. This is very unusual for us. You know, the German business world is very meticulous. There's a lot of rules. You know, they follow all the details. So for them to sort of jump outside of the normal course of business, it felt like something was going on, but I certainly had no idea. So I start composing for this big promo, big action release. There was 3 sets of composers on it, is what I learned. I was doing 15 tracks. Another team was doing 10 tracks. Somebody else was doing 5 tracks. And I got going. I was writing the music at night after work as quickly as I could, but I wasn't going to make it in a month. And I reached back out to them. I'm working. Here's some of the music, but I can't do it in a month. I played them the music and they really liked it. And I was like, oh, whew, okay. They were like, we have more than a month. I was like, oh, whew. All right. What was the situation? How did I get my first music library job at the end of 1997? I finally got the answer. A composer in New York who worked at a music house had been hired to do those 15 pieces of music. But what happened was he was an employee at this music house, and the owner of the music house found out about his side job. And he was okay with him doing the side job, but the owner of the music house said, hey, by the way, my name will be co-composer on all those tracks with you. What that means is that the owner of the music house wanted half of the composer royalties, but he had no plans on actually working on the music. It was just one of those things. Hey, you work in my music house, and I'm sure he probably thought, you got this connection for this gig because you work at my music house, and so I'm going to get part of the money. Nobody ever said that to me, but that would be my assumption of the way that conversation went. And I got this story firsthand from the New York composer. And why is that? Because I had no idea who he was. The reason I got the story firsthand is he called me because when he signed on to do the job, Sonaton had paid him half the money. That's just how they worked. When they signed you on, you got half the money of the job. So he had been paid. But when the owner of that music house said, I'm going to be co-composer on those tracks, the guy goes, no. The owner of the music house said, I don't care whether you do the job or not, but if you do, my name goes as co-composer. So the composer threw his hands in the air and said, well, I'm not doing the job. And the owner of the house said, I don't care. So the composer got back in touch with Sonaton and said, I'm not doing the job. And Sonaton's like, hey, we have a signed contract. We gave you money. He's like, I don't care. I'll give it back. And they were like, no, don't give it back. But we have to figure this out. So Sonaton made him write me a check for whatever they had paid him. I don't remember the amount. So my first job came from a composer who no longer wanted the job, but had gotten paid part of the money. And so my first monies came from another composer who I had no relationship with. The world is full of crazy stories, and this one just had me reeling. But I was working my butt off, and I was grinding away every night. You know, I had my mix job in the day and doing all my stuff, and then at night I was writing the music. And I'm going to tell you, I gave everything I had to that music library job. I was up till probably 4 or 5 in the morning, almost every night, trying to create quality music and adhere to all of their demands. And it took me 2.5 months to do it, and that was fine. It worked within the real deadline. Nobody ever tells composers what the real deadline is. And I remember the final night to finish this first production, I stayed up the whole night and I never went to bed. And I just packed myself up and went to work. And I had a FedEx package ready to go. It had to ship to Austria. And I shipped it out and my body fell apart. And I immediately came down with the flu and bronchitis at the same time. I was so worn out. And that was the first commercial library music project for me. The interesting part was I wanted to stay home because I was so sick, but the studio said, no. You can't stay home. You have to come in. I'm like, I am as sick as you could possibly be. There's no way I can work. And they're like, the only other person that can sit in that chair is one of the owners, and he has a stomach virus, so he can't actually sit in the chair. They're like, you got to come in. And I'm like, no, I don't want to come in. And they're like, please, please, please. And so I was the sickest I've ever been in my whole life. And I went in and I did a session and I said, I don't care what I feel like tomorrow. I am not coming in. They're like, fine. So the next day I stayed home, even though I was starting to feel better. But ironically, I was home and the phone rang and it was Austria. They had gotten the music and they had listened to it. And the owner of Sonaton himself called me and said, thank you for making such a great production. And I was like, oh my gosh, normally I would never be home. How did these things happen? So that was the conclusion of my first project. And that project did really well with Sonaton. And there'll be more about Sonaton in the next chapter. So now it was early 1998. The library job was done. My wife and I were really dreaming about moving to Los Angeles, but moving to LA and getting work, it's not so easy. That's a pretty tough town. But a friend of mine who had worked at Soundwave moved to LA and was working at a super busy audio post house. And he said he was willing to put the good word in for me at that studio. So my wife and I flew to LA. I interviewed a few places around town, and the last one was at my friend's studio. The owner sat down with me and he said, oh yeah, Rich says you're a good mixer. It's going to get really busy around here. I got a job for you. That was it. He just offered me the job just like that. No demo, no resume, no nothing. He was more than doubling my Washington, D.C. salary. And we set a date, and that date was going to give us enough time to give notice to work, pack, deal with movers, drive across the country, settle into a new apartment, doing all those things. And it was great. The LA dream was turning into a reality. But it wasn't going to be that easy. I mentioned we had agreed on a start date at the studio in Los Angeles, but it turns out that studio got super busy with a cable channel launch, and they were going 6 days a week, double shifts. That's why he had offered me the job. He knew it was coming up, but now it had actually hit. It's Monday, my last week at Soundwave in Washington, D.C., and I'm booked all week, Monday through Friday. Phone rings on Monday. It's my future boss on the phone. And he goes, I need you here tomorrow, man. And I'm like, whoa, I am not getting up and walking out of this studio and leaving them in a lurch. I just don't do that. I'm booked all week. And he says, all right, do your sessions through Friday. I'm buying you a plane ticket. You have to be here on Saturday. If you are not here this Saturday, I can't guarantee you the job anymore. And I'm like, oh, I'm thinking, what happened to that month? We have to do all that stuff. I said, okay. The very next day in FedEx, a plane ticket showed up for Saturday. Like, oh my gosh, she's not playing any games. I had to abandon my wife. She had to deal with the move. There was no driving across country. We just shipped the car out. She had a job in LA. She was able to transfer with her company, so she had her stuff to worry about. And there was one more hitch in that in the DC studio, I had been using that AMS audio file, that Neve Logic 3, but in LA, they were using Pro Tools, and I had never used Pro Tools in a session. I had learned the basics of Pro Tools, and I knew how to run it in general. but not in a high pressure promo setting. And I show up to LA on the Saturday and it was turbo from the go. I was dumped into double shifts, sometimes 6 days a week, and that paid full like overtime, like time and a half, like beyond the regular 40 hours. I was making so much more money than I had been making in Washington. I think at one point it was like almost triple. It was so busy. It was a trial by fire. But you got to talk about Los Angeles and some of the demands there. You know, he offered me that job, but you got to prove yourself to keep it. And you can't make mistakes. In Los Angeles, you could not make mistakes. And that was demonstrated one night. It was 3 a.m. Everybody's tired. Everybody's probably been there double shifts. And it was down to me and a freelancer in another room. And he was ready to put his audio back to the master videotape. And you have to insert that carefully. The last thing you want to do is erase the tape. Well, he hit full record, crash recorded that tape, erased the video. Client was very frustrated. And that poor freelancer never stepped foot in that building ever again. You're in this dynamic environment. You're trying to get Pro Tools learned. You're trying to deliver on these commercials. You're working very long hours. That was the start to LA. Okay, I'm going to pause part 2 here. We're in Los Angeles. Things are on the upswing. In the next studio chat, we'll finally get into the world of Epic Score. I will see you next week. I've got a really nice interview with an executive in the music library world. Alex Black has been at the top of the industry. He was the global director for EMI's production music. I don't think you can find a bigger position than that. Super nice guy. I've had a long relationship with him. He's been my distributor in several places. We'll talk about that. I'll see you then.